honored to be here with you. And I got to start with a wonderful woman that I know who is going to turn 93 years old on April 5th. 89 years ago, when she was 4 years old, she was sitting in a cold and kind of scary waiting room in a hospital in Wenatchee, Washington. She was waiting for the arrival of her sister, Diane. And as she was sitting there, out of nowhere comes this nurse, just kind of appears in all of her beautiful nurse whites, kind of like a guardian angel. And she sat down with Pat and she chatted with her, eased her a little bit. And then she reached in her pocket and she pulled out and gave Pat an orange. Pat never forgot that. In fact, it was such a profound moment in her life that she too went on to become a nurse. After World War II, she studied, practiced. She was over in Hawaii. And then she met her husband, Keith, and got married at 29. Now, back in that generation, getting married at 29 and starting a family is kind of late. So she wasted no time and had 7 kids in 9 years. Yeah. And if you want to know if God has a sense of humor, he put her in charge of the sex ed program at her kids' school, St. Brendan's in Bothell, Washington. Makes sense, doesn't it? Well, after her brood had grown and gone, Pat went back into nursing and she volunteered for nearly 3 decades at Overlake Hospital in Bellevue. Till most recently, when she's been attending to her husband, Keith, of 65 years, who's been battling Alzheimer's. So a pretty amazing run. And when I sat down with her and I asked her, over 70 years, all of the people that you have touched, she told me it was because of that single stranger, that nurse that showed up that morning and gave her an orange. And when she got that orange, she knew that that was her calling in life. She would be a nurse. So I learned that we are so busy looking for these big stories in our life that it's not big stories of love and loss that defines who we are and where we're going, but those scenes, those simple moments that have shaped who we are today. Now, I learned this starting really back in 2006 when I started headlong into studying the applied science and bewitchery of storytelling. See, leading up to this, I'd been in the advertising and marketing world for 20 years. And I was starting to see, because of technology, that where brands used to own the influence of mass media, the masses became the media. They owned the narrative, and they created a cacophony of communication. You know how hard it is now to stand out, to rise above the noise, to be heard, or to even be identified for that matter. Well, our clients were feeling the same way, so I had to go and find an answer. And what I learned in that search is that an anecdote is the antidote. The human mind yields helplessly to the suction of story. Jonathan Gottschall wrote that in his amazing book called The Storytelling Animal, Why Stories Make Us Human. Think about it, storytelling is probably the single most powerful evolutionary tool we have. Stories literally have evolved us from cavemen and women to consumers. It's how we make meaning out of the madness of being human beings. Science now is really studying this and trying to figure out exactly how does story work on our brains and our bodies. And they will do the functional magnetic imaging and they will look and they will see where your brain lights up when you're listening to a story and your brain actually thinks you are an active participant in that story. Kind of crazy. Blood tests show that a great story can release up to 5 different neurotransmitters. They include serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, cortisol, and endorphins. When I was invited to come and give this presentation, I was pumped. In fact, my brain was filled with serotonin because I felt wanted, I felt important, and it just made me happy. Too little serotonin in our lives actually depresses us. So I was so proud of my first script. Sent it in, strutting around saying, this is going to be awesome. Until it came back and said, you know what, this needs a lot of work. Good idea, but it's kind of buried in here, so I think you need to get back after it. Well, I can tell you my cortisol pump jumped into speed right there, giving me the focus I need to fight through that. And then when I was writing it in my 11th hour and trying to get it done in time, well, that's when the endorphins kicked in. Gave me my second win to get through, and ultimately the euphoria of overcoming this challenge. To me, storytelling is like rocket fuel. It literally ignites these volatile neuropropellants in our brains that transports us from one world to another. Ira Glass of This American Life talks about an anecdote having a momentum all itself. He says that even if you have a story with boring facts in it, if it's a well-told story, it feels like you were on a train to a destination. It has this amazing momentum. But here's the challenge. We are implored to be telling our stories all the time. And so often we think about the Ira Glass scale stories and we think ours don't measure up. Well, here's the disruption I want you to be thinking about. Stop thinking about your story and start finding your scenes, those moments that have shaped who you are today. Because in those moments, you're going to find your superpower. This was underscored to me a couple weeks ago when I met an amazing lady. Her name was Angela Crow, a Ukrainian immigrant. She works for a very fast-paced, high-tech company out of New York that happened to be here in Arizona for their annual conference. And I had the good fortune of taking them through a storytelling program for half a day. Well, Angela got up. She volunteered to tell us her story. She was so proud. She sat there and she said, you know, my sole purpose here at this company is to build alliances and partnerships, and I'm really good at it, and they're really important. So I was coaching her in front of 60 of her colleagues. I said, that's great, Angela, but can you take us to a moment when you knew that this was one of your superpowers? Well, she kind of looked over at me, and she kind of actually physically moved away, and I knew she wasn't into telling us what that moment was. And I thought, well, maybe it's because she's in front of all of her colleagues, or maybe it was just a really sad time in her life and she just didn't want to share it in public. We wrapped up the session and Angela came up to me afterwards and she said, you know, Park, I didn't tell you the whole story. I said, yeah, I know, why is that? She goes, well, I've been told here in America that nobody wants to hear about the hard times I had in the orphanage. I said, orphanage? You grew up in a Ukrainian orphanage? She said, yeah, born there, raised there till I was 18. It was tough. People picked on me. I got abused. I said, oh my God, how did you cope? She goes, well, I remember one morning waking up. I can't remember if I was 8 or 9, but I realized if I was going to survive this, that I had to surround myself only with the kids that I could trust. And I actually had to look for the adults that not only cared for me, but cared about me. And I said, oh my God, you literally have been building alliances and partnerships ever since you were a little girl. She goes, I had to. It was the only way I could survive. Well, then I learned about Angela that when she got out of there at 18, she came to America. She went to the University of Georgia in Atlanta, got 2 degrees, then went on to Georgia State and earned her MBA in international business, and has had a pretty stellar technology career ever since, and she's probably only 35. And I told her, I said, Angela, you absolutely have to tell your story. You are the epitome of the American dream. Rags to riches. Immigrant comes to town, works hard, and achieves something. And it all started in that moment when you realized that building alliances and partnerships was a real superpower of yours. All back in this day in a Ukrainian orphanage. Well, she looked at me and she said, thank you. And I think it was the first time she's ever gotten permission to tell that story. And I asked her, may I have your permission to tell your story tonight at this event? And you know what Angela said to me? Absolutely. That is the power of the moments and the scenes in all of our lives. Stop looking for the stories and start finding the scenes that have shaped who you are. But when you do, you become literally the protagonist, the center of your story. And like every protagonist in every story, when they reach to try to do something, when they try to get out of status quo, the universe is going to push back. It's going to punch you in the nose. It's going to want to test your character just to see if you're up to the task. How badly do you really want it? The universe has quite a powerful platform out there in this day and age called social media, where it seems like everybody's running around in fiction. Think about it. Every time you post something, you get that little like button. That is the opioid pusher of the web. Serotonin, dopamine, endorphins flood into us and we love it. So what do? We put our happy faces out there all the time, even when we're feeling sad. It's inauthentic to us. And then what else do? FOMO, the fear of missing out. How often have you been that fawning voyeur to someone else's grand adventure, feeling like yours don't really quite measure up? And then perhaps the greatest personal mistake we make with our narrative is we compare what we think are our simple little stories to everybody else's epic fictions. That doesn't work for us very well either, because it feels inauthentic to us. Being connected to people in our lives is essential for our sanity and for our survival. But what do? We try to overconnect sometimes, and we start living into other people's lives, playing roles in those lives, living into their stories on their terms, all trying to connect. But what does this do to us? Quite often we feel like it's inauthentic. We feel unworthy, alienated, and lonely. And really one of the biggest things that happens when we start living to other people's lives is we lose confidence in ourselves because we are trying to measure up to their expectations. I can tell you the day the universe came calling and gave me a wake up. Monday, September 14th, 2015. I woke up with a knot in my stomach because I knew I was going to have to make a major change. You see, I had been in the advertising world, as I mentioned. I'd been running an agency for 20 years. Now, it's something that I've worked at tirelessly. We started in a little shack behind our very first home. It grew. We added lots of employees. We built a building. And I created a company I thought that defined me. And I always had a good time for a while doing that because I thought I was also building a career that my mom and dad would be proud of, that my siblings would appreciate, and even my peers would respect. But you know what? I wasn't happy because I just wasn't living into my own story. The answer was sitting right before me, right plain sight. In fact, I'd been preaching and teaching it for many years, and it comes back to this idea of story. We had been helping brands around the world create their brand story strategy to make their impact. We had so much success in this area, it was almost started to get out of our advertising realm that Arizona State University called 5 years ago and said, Park, we're pretty fascinated with what you guys are doing with this. Would you mind writing a curriculum for the Executive Masters for Sustainability Leadership in Communications based on your story cycle system? Which I did, and then I had the distinct honor of teaching for 4 years. I mean, I got to work with executives around the world. So here comes the universe. Wakes up and he says, dude, what are you doing? You have to get out of this advertising world and start doing this over here. And I'm like, this is a major pivot. For a dude at 55, midlife, that's tough, but I knew I had to do it. So now what I did, jumped in with both feet. I consult, teach, coach, and speak on the power of story to folks just like you to help you find your personal narrative so that you can go out and make the most profound impact in the world on your terms. All compelling stories starts in the moment. Moments are the experiences that are all unique to us. Those experiences then lead to our beliefs. The beliefs lead to our personal truths. When we unwrap those truths, we find our absolute gifts that we bring to this world, our superpowers. Now, it may not look like this guy, but that's the metaphor that I want you to take away. What is your superpower that you could nudge the world in any direction you choose by living in and embracing the scenes and the moments in your life that make you uniquely you? Now, here's the toughest part about this whole storytelling scene thing. Hollywood calls it the dark night of the soul. I kind of prefer the belly of the whale. I know someone who might call it Ukrainian orphanage. But it is in our moments of struggle, when the universe is putting the screws to you and your character, that you will probably find your most compelling, pivotal scenes in your life that actually propel your stories forward. But like an archaeologist, you have to go and dig them up. They're often hidden under the detritus of life. Or they don't immediately come to our recall because they're unpleasant. Or they're buried underneath the piles of scripts that people think that we need to be playing to. Let me give you an example. I'm going to take you to a kitchen. There's a 9-year-old boy there named James, and he's hanging out with his aunt. His aunt's drinking some tea, and James is absolutely fascinated by this tea kettle on the stove that is still boiling away and spewing out steam out of the spout. So much so he gets up on a chair, he has a spoon, he holds it over, he watches the condensation build up, he watches the drops of water come off, and he is just blown away by this phenomenon that he's trying to figure out. Well, James's aunt is pissed. She thinks he's idling away, messing around, lazy, yells at him, James, why don't you get down and go do something, read a book, do something productive for a change. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? How do you think James felt? Have you ever had anyone say that to you because he just misunderstood who you are and what you're up to? Well, thank goodness for us that James went on undaunted, because 20 years later, in 1765, at the age of 29, James Watt created a kind of steam engine that ushered in the Industrial Revolution, a momentous time that all started with a moment at a teapot. Now, what TED Talk would be complete without a reference to Steve Jobs? When he was a student at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, he was taking a calligraphy class, and people were saying, Steve, what are you doing? Why are you wasting your time and money doing this? But what did his fascination lead to? The graphical design, Apple computer, and a complete revolution in how we compute. So you see, even revolutions begin in moments of discovery and inspiration. So what are your scenes? What are your moments? Stop looking for the big story and find out those moments that absolutely define who you are. When you do, wonderful things happen. You will begin to clarify your origin story. So people will have a better understanding of who you are, what you're about, where you come from, and where you are going. Starts creating real empathy. With that empathy, then, you start amplifying your impact because you get to share your real-world experiences with those close to you. They get to experience it to connect your shared beliefs and values. And then finally, what it does for you, it simply helps you simplify your life because you just get to be you. Here's what I want you to do tonight. Before you go to bed, pull out a pen and a paper and write down on that time when. Those 3 words will lead you to an amazing place. And answer questions like this. Any questions you want that get you to that moment, that time when your curiosity took you down a path that surprised you and literally changed the course of your life. Or that time when a seemingly insignificant moment had a surprising impact on you. Or that time when you overcame something you thought you could never do. So I want to ask you, what is your enlightened calligraphy moment? What is your inspired teapot incident? What is your episode of being abandoned and feeling lonely? Or, like my mom, Nurse Howell, what is that symbolic orange in your life that inspired your purpose? Then in the morning, knit those scenes together. And you never know, you might even have the universe there knocking on your door, get a little pit in your stomach, changing your course. Regardless of what happens, I promise you will learn what I have learned, that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thank you.